Welcome to another live episode of The Breakdown. I'm your host, Nate Pike. We're doing our Alberta Politics Roundup tonight, and it's been a week. It's been a week. I mean, technically, it's been like two since we did one of these, but boy, this last week has been something else. We have a lot to talk about tonight, so we're going to jump right into things. Because there's been a lot of not great things that have happened in the province of Alberta. The Alberta government has been making some sweeping changes to how a lot of things are going to be done. And we got to talk about some of those right out of the gate. So to start with, in our continuing segment, What's Wrong with Mike Ellis, we got to talk about supervised consumption sites for a minute. Because the province recently announced that they will be closing the supervised consumption sites in Calgary and a couple other places, with plans to close all of the supervised consumption sites across the province eventually as things get ramped up, which is actually an interesting admission, because the argument is, and we'll hear a little bit from Mike in a sec, but the argument that they're trying to advance is we have built such a robust recovery system, the Alberta model, the internationally renowned, maybe not for all the right reasons, Alberta model. It's recovery focused. It's focused on the recovery. And so with that in mind, we want to make sure that there are all of that infrastructure is in place before we close the supervised consumption site. They're making the argument that in Calgary, there's the infrastructure in place, which is actually like I said, it's a weird little sort of tacit admission that supervised consumption sites do in fact save lives, because they do. And we'll get to that in a sec. But first, we gotta listen to Mike Ellis's revisionist version of history for a second.
Consumption sites were introduced at the beginning of the opioid crisis as a short-term emergency measure. Treatment options and recovery support then were far more limited than they are today. So now, through the internationally recognized Alberta recovery model, we have significantly expanded treatment capacity. We've removed financial barriers to care, invested in detox and stabilization treatments, and established new recovery-oriented services.
Well, he's got the right idea, but the wrong map, I guess. Certainly in Alberta, we didn't see supervised consumption sites until the opioid crisis really started ramping up. But if we're going to talk about why supervised consumption sites became a thing, framing them as only a response to the opioid crisis is not only disingenuous, it's just wrong. It's just wrong. Because if we take a look at what the first supervised consumption site in North America was, we have to talk about Insight in BC. And when we're talking about Insight in BC, from their own website, Insight was born from a public health crisis. Oh, but wait, it wasn't the opioid crisis. It was the 1990s AIDS epidemic. In 1997, PHS hosted the International Out of Harm's Way Conference in Vancouver, which included presentations about supervised injection in Germany and models of heroin maintenance in Switzerland and the UK. It was a watershed event in Vancouver's move towards more humane and pragmatic approaches to drug use. In February 2003, PHS forced the hand of three levels of government by establishing HealthQuest, an injection site made possible by private donations to be operated by volunteers if authorities did not offer their support. As it happened, Vancouver Coastal Health rapidly became a partner in the lease, funding a renovation that also included detox beds to create Insight, which opened in September 2003. So, to be very, very, very clear right out of the gates, that's why supervised consumption sites came to North America. It was a response to the AIDS crisis and the multiple health problems that come when people are using injection drugs, because they end up sharing needles. There's sanitary issues. Addressing those saves the healthcare system down the road, and is also a much more compassionate approach to taking care of people and offering people help. But there's going to be some people who say, oh, but Nate, that's BC. Why don't we talk about Alberta? Okay, let's do that then, because unfortunately, the data for supervised consumption sites has been not as publicly available as we would have liked it to be. So we have to go back a little bit farther than we would like, back to 2019, in order to see some published actual data. This is from the Alberta Community Council on HIV, because again, supervised consumption sites do a whole lot more than just address opioid use. What did that report have to say? Well, supervised consumption sites play an essential role in supporting people who are ready for addiction and treatment services. Since opening, over 35,000 health and social referrals have been through the SCS, including over 10,000 to addiction and treatment services. Let me read that part again because it seems like it might be important. Over 10,000 referrals through the supervised consumption sites to addiction and treatment services. Contrary to misperceptions about the service, guiding people into recovery and support is a core part of the SCS mandate. Key facts discussed in this report include over 300,000 people have visited an SCS with over 400 unique monthly clients per site. And this is just going up to 2019, by the way. 4,305 overdose reversals with a 100% success rate. People don't die in supervised consumption sites because there's people who are there to provide care for them immediately. A total of 3,709 averted EMS calls through the SCS. 89% of overdoses are averted. Again, over 10,000 referrals to addiction and treatment services, prevention and reduction of HIV and hepatitis C infections through access to new supplies, hygienic environment, and access to treatment, prevention and reduction of other STBBI infections like syphilis and gonorrhea through access to safe sex supplies, needle debris program, and this is true, quantifiably reduced the needles around the supervised consumption site and improved response for community needle reports. And here's the big thing that should make sense to anybody who's paying any kind of attention. Supervised consumption sites in Canada provide cost savings with an estimated $5 saved for every dollar spent, according to recent estimates. So, what's the takeaway here? Supervised consumption sites are not just about, we're enabling people to use the drugs. We've talked a lot about supervised consumption sites on this show for a lot of years now. And the reality is they do a whole lot more than that. And at their core, the critical part is they build relationships, because the people who are coming into supervised consumption sites are navigating trauma. They're navigating all kinds of different hardship and experience. And the supervised consumption sites allow for the people who work there to build relationships. That's why they were able to do, just in the first couple of years, 10,000 referrals to addiction and treatment services. And I am not by any stretch of the imagination suggesting that we should not have treatment services readily available. But the notion that where we're at in Alberta right now, anybody can just raise their hand and get into treatment it's false. It's just false. If you talk to people who work down at the DI here in Calgary, the detox facility is first come, first serve. They can't accommodate regularly. They can't accommodate everybody who is trying to access that service. There are simply not enough services, even in a major center like Calgary right now. Closing the supervised consumption site will decrease the way that people can build relationships so that they feel safe enough to ask for help and go into treatment programs. And this is something that has been said over and over and over and over again by people who live and work in that community. But Mike Ellis, the big time Mr. Copman, he thinks that he knows all of the answers. And it's not just there will be people who will say, but Nate, the government just produced that report from their core research group that's part of the same institution that is responsible for rolling out these policies. So it's almost as if that research group exists purely to justify the policies. Yeah, you can say that, but unfortunately, for anybody who's making that argument, there's a whole bunch of data from supervised consumption sites across the country that say otherwise, going back to Insight, a 2008 cost-benefit analysis of the site in the Canadian Medical Association Journal observed net savings of $18 million and an increase of 1,175 life years over 10 years. Another cost-benefit analysis published in the International Journal of Drug Policy in 2010 determined that the site prevents 35 cases of HIV and about 3 deaths per year, indicating a net social benefit of more than $6 million. An editorial in the Canadian Medical Association Journal noted that after 3 years of research, a remarkable consensus that the facility reduces harm to users and the public developed among scientists, criminologists, and even the Vancouver Police Department. In 2011, The Lancet published a study by a team of researchers from the University of British Columbia claiming 35% decreases in overdose deaths around Insight due to its presence. So you will forgive me, I hope, if the research that came from CORE that has already been condemned by experts across the country is one that I view with more than a little bit of skepticism, given that their findings go in the completely opposite direction, but in the same direction as the policies that the government wants to pursue. And just in case I haven't really managed to articulate just how ignorant this whole decision is, I'm going to let Mike speak for himself to demonstrate just how ignorant he actually is.
Well, there's no such thing as a safe drug. I don't know who's telling you there's such thing as a safe drug. If that was the truth, then they would have no issues in British Columbia where they are doling out hydromorphone to all of the addicts. You have to understand something. And this is understanding addiction. So addicts want we call it the good stuff, right? So when there is a drug that you call toxic, I don't call toxic because all drugs are dangerous. But let me just use your terminology. Is that if I was to call it a toxic drug, and it is something that is killing people, that becomes desirable for an addict. They consider that to be the good stuff. They're not dissuaded by that.
That's the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard. For so many different reasons. Yes, there are plenty of safe drugs. It is, if you ask anybody who works in medicine, are there safe drugs? It's not the drug, it's how the drug that is used, the way in which the drug is used, and the quality of the drug. That's what determines whether or not it's safe. And it's rhetoric like that. I'm going to put on my paramedic hat for just a second, speaking only for myself and no other organizations that I may or may not be affiliated with. It is exhausting. It is exhausting for me as a paramedic to be working in an environment where one of the frontline drugs that we use safely for treating people who are in severe pain is fentanyl. It is. And when used in the proper way, it is a very, very safe, very, very good drug for people for whom it's appropriate. The number of times that I have picked people up who have been in major traumas or are in major pain for a long list of reasons, and the most appropriate drug for them is fentanyl. And when I tell them that, the fear that they experience because of this ramped up bullshit rhetoric that we see from politicians like Mike Ellis is absolutely heartbreaking. Because now this person who's already having a terrible, terrible day, I have to try to educate into, no, I understand that you're scared, but that's not how any of this works. It's hyperbolic rhetoric. And that's only emphasized further by the fact that Mr. Ellis decides to go through let me tell you about understanding addiction. And then proceeds to follow up with what is quite possibly one of the most ignorant and simplified understandings of addiction that I think I've ever heard. The addicts, they want the good stuff. They want the good stuff. If they find out that it's killing people, they're more excited about that. That's utter bullshit. It's utter bullshit. It's completely ignorant. Addicts people who use drugs aren't using drugs because they think it's going to kill them. They're using drugs for a whole long list of reasons. But here's a fun little fact that Mike Ellis, who likes to talk about the fact that he was a police officer, so he had lots of interactions. If Mike Ellis had actually talked to anybody who was dealing with addiction and trying to understand, for example, why it is that people who are using like to use in public places like C-train stations, if he bothered to talk to any of those people, he might be able to glean a little bit of knowledge that the reason why they do that is because there's security cameras there that are monitored, and they know if they go down, somebody's going to come. And that's the reality of the whole supervised consumption site conversation. There's this idea that supervised consumption sites are where people who are using congregate. And there is some truth to that, for sure. But if you close down the official ones, the real ones that have healthcare workers there, you're going to see more and more people who are using, congregating in those public places with those video cameras that they know are monitored. And that's just one example of all of the backwards ways, without even talking about the toxic supply. There's a new drug that's mixed in with a lot of the down supply, which is the broad name for opioids these days. And it has no reversal agent. There's nothing that you can do for somebody who has been hit with that drug if they've used something that they thought was fentanyl or codeine or OxyContin or any of the opiates, heroin. I mean, I haven't seen heroin in a long time, but any of those things. If that's what they thought they were using, and it turns out that they're getting this other drug, there's nothing you can do but breathe for them and wait. And when we're talking about people who are overdosing on that drug, and we're seeing a big surge of it in Calgary right now, making sure that there's a healthcare worker who can do those things for that person nearby is the best way to keep those people alive, so that you can build those relationships and so that you can get them into recovery and treatment. And I know I talk a lot about my friend Guy Felicella here on the phone. I'm going to do it again because I got a little sneak preview of his documentary, which is, by the way, it's going to win awards. It's so good. It's so good. But in that documentary, Guy talks about the fact that it was in the moments after he was resuscitated where he realized that he needed to make changes. And he was resuscitated in a supervised consumption site. And if you take a look at the good work that Guy does, the difference he has made for so many people, to say that people shouldn't be allowed to use access supervised consumption sites, how many lives would that have robbed of the good work that Guy does? So Mike Ellis is wrong. The UCP are wrong. They're taking a myopic approach to a complex problem, and they're trying to present it as if they're taking a complex approach. But it all boils down to one thing. There's this, one of my favorite jokes. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. It's making the light bulb, which is the drug user in this clumsy metaphor, feel safe enough so that they can ask for that help to change. And what the UCP is doing is the exact opposite of that. Moving on from there. Oh, we're basing the show, a lot of the show tonight, we're basing it on the, there's so much. The Standing Committee on Alberta's Economic Future, the consideration of main estimates, which was the examination, supposed to be the examination of the budget, the budget purposes. And this was a bit of a head-to-head between the NDP leader, Naheed Nenshi, and the UCP leader, Danielle Smith. And there were a couple of other UCP MLAs who peppered in some questions that we're not going to listen to because they were so softball, it was painful. But we're going to highlight a few things because there was a lot of it made the news this week. There was a lot of it that came out of that meeting. And we're going to start with a referendum question.
The Premier has highlighted on several occasions that she will not allow for an unconstitutional question to appear on a referendum ballot. But we know from a judge that the question that is being petitioned right now is unconstitutional. And we know that one of the questions the Premier has put forth as her 9 bad questions has been ruled unconstitutional by a court just in the last 2 weeks. So what is being spent now to do the legal analysis to figure out how to make these things constitutional? And what is the government's response to the non-confidence vote by all the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 nations, all the chiefs, relating to the unconstitutionality of this? How are we going to pay for it? And how will Executive Council figure all of this out?
It's a reasonable question. And it gets to the core of the purpose of the referendum, which is there was the rules that they made under Jason Kenney, and then Danielle Smith adjusted them, and then she adjusted them again, and she's probably going to adjust them again in order to wiggle past her problems here. But the core of the question is, you've said multiple times on the record that you won't allow a non-constitutional question, and in true Danny fashion, it didn't take but a minute for her to move the goalposts.
The way the Citizen Initiative Act is written is it's meant to be permissive. It's meant to allow for citizens to identify an issue that's of concern to them and to bring it forward without gatekeepers, without us deciding they can't do it, or the elections officials deciding they can't do it, or a court deciding that they can't do it. If they get the requisite number of signatures, which is 177,000 over a 120-day period, then it will go to a process where those signatures will be validated, which is vitally important. We saw with the Forever Canada petition that there were some 50,000 signatures that were not considered valid. So that is important as part of the process. And then we will have an idea by June whether or not that is a valid petition that has collected signatures in the appropriate way. It's up to government to then, we have a committee that's looking at the Forever Canada petition. It's up to government to then put these forward on a ballot, and depending on what the outcome is, to make sure that they're implemented in a constitutional way.
See? So it doesn't matter if the question is not constitutional, because that's not how the process works. Danny explains the process very well. See, the first thing you have to do is you got to bring a question, and nobody should be able to tell you what questions you can or cannot bring. Then you got to get the signatures, and if you get the number of signatures, then you get your question on the ballot. It goes to the committee, who will then decide whether or not it goes on the ballot or whether or not it gets voted on in the legislature, because those are the only two options under the rules. And then depending on the results of that referendum, once the people have spoken, then it's up to the government to decide how to implement the results of that referendum in a constitutional way, which is so bonkers. It's so bonkers. And it's bonkers because if you have a question that's patently not constitutional, it should not be allowed on the ballot. If you have a question that is patently violating treaty rights, it should not be allowed on the ballot. But don't take it from me. I'm just a podcast host. We should probably turn to somebody who has some authority. Like, I don't know, maybe the Justice Minister.
The bill states specifically and unequivocally that any referendum question that offends sections 1 through 35.1 of the Constitution will simply not be allowed, Mr. Speaker. The division is absolutely absurd. The Act itself has a provision that describes the exact scenario that the member is posturing about. That will not happen. It is non-negotiable. Treaty rights will be respected in this province.
Given that a court has already said that the question is unconstitutional, and given the Premier said this weekend that her Justice Minister might amend the separatist petition question before it goes to Albertans, and given that this would be the first, second, third, fourth time in a year that the UCP will be directly intervening to keep separatism on the agenda in Alberta, and given that if the UCP writes the referendum question, it would be confirmation that separatism was never really a so-called citizen initiative, but actually a UCP government initiative. And given that most Albertans already believe the Premier herself will vote in support of separatism, why won't the Premier just admit that the UCP is a separatist government?
Once again, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the signatures have not even been submitted. We don't even know if there is going to be a sufficient number of signatures to trigger a referendum in this province. Referendums are a citizen-led initiative, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is here. I'm going to say it one more time for all of the Assembly and all of our guests in this legislature. Any question that violates the Constitution, sections 1 through 35.1, any question that deals with a matter that breaches treaty rights is non-negotiable. It will not happen in this province.
I guess Danny wasn't in the room for that whole clarification because that was on March 9th. And Danny's little diatribe was like a week and 3 days later. So that's good. We're mucking about with constitutional issues. We're doing an incredibly job of offending and disrespecting the treaties and the treaty partners. And apparently, Team UCP doesn't even know what the rules are. And it's not like it's just the backbenchers. What Danielle Smith said in Maine estimates was completely different than what Mickey Amory said like a week beforehand in the legislature. They don't know what they're talking about. We're messing with the fabric of the province and the country, and the two people who should be the most informed clearly don't have a clue what they're talking about. That's not great. It's not particularly great. But that was just the start. There were a lot of questions that came up. And the next one that we need to talk about is Danielle Smith's whole trip to PragerU. For anybody who's unfamiliar, PragerU is a very conservative, little on the Christian nationalisty side of things. They're an online, not a university, but they call themselves PragerU. See how that works? It's not at all disingenuous. They're like a think tank, and they're problematic. We'll just leave it at that. If you want to go down the rabbit hole, we've talked about them on other episodes. You can do that, or you can just Google them and have a can of bleach beside you to clear your eyes out when you're done. But for anybody who's not familiar, Danielle Smith went on a taxpayers paid for this fundraiser for PragerU. And this came up.
We learned through expense disclosures that the Premier's office spent nearly $20,000, $19,442 to be exact, to send the Premier and 4 staff to Florida for the PragerU Gala, a private fundraising event with tickets starting at $1,500 USD. The Premier defended this trip as advocacy on tariffs. So the question 5, why were the taxpayers fundraising attendance at a private fundraising gala? And I don't care about the purpose or that it was about tariff advocacy. The specifics of the taxpayers funding a fundraiser for a private U.S. organization is what I'm interested in, because there's lots of other ways to do tariff advocacy. Question 6, if this was tariff advocacy by name, who did the Premier advocate to at that event, and what concrete outcomes resulted? But the Premier, for a single 2-hour event, required the Chief of Staff, the Press Secretary, 2 advanced staff, plus security. Will the Premier provide a full breakdown of each staff member's role and the cost for each one? Now, Mr. Shapiro, who the Premier appeared on stage with, has a lot of anti-Muslim values that he has expressed. It caused a lot of division in the community. Does the Premier feel that this was worth it, given the division it caused? And can the Premier name one measurable outcome from the PragerU trip that justified nearly $20,000 in public money? We got one YouTube video out of it. Was one YouTube video worth $20,000?
The core of that question has to be the idea of, look, if Danny wanted to go down to PragerU and attend the little gala thing, cool, she's allowed to do that. She's a free person. But should she have been using taxpayers' money? Should she also have been using taxpayers' money to bring down, I think it was 7 staff that Nancy said there, for the 2-hour event? Was that necessary? Could she have gone on her own? Could she have gone with maybe 1 or 2? Was it necessary to bring all of those people on the taxpayer dime at the cost of $20,000? Because there's actually very strict rules about this. And conservatives in the province of Alberta, I shouldn't say that, because I really don't. I take that back. I'm going to walk that back, because I don't think that the Danielle Smith is a conservative. I don't, because real conservatives, I would argue, would not be okay with using taxpayers' money to go down to the States to fund a political advocacy group. As I recall, in the run-up to the 2019 election, there was quite a bit of upsettedness that was going on with the idea that government money was going to support, or any money was going to support, trying to influence the political atmosphere in Alberta if it was money coming outside of Alberta. But somehow all of a sudden for Danielle Smith to head on down to the States and use taxpayers' money to support political advocacy in the States, that's just fine. It's just fine. It doesn't make any sense. But what makes even less sense is Smith's answer.
When it comes to the event at PragerU, gosh, I guess that was March of 2025. So not this past year, but I guess the previous year. So it's 2 public accounts ago, I guess. What I would say is we have to remember where we found ourselves in January of 2025 when the new president first came in and began making good on threats to impose tariffs on Canadian goods. One of the things that we were looking for was advocates in the United States who would be able to have some influence on the U.S. president to get them to change direction. PragerU is a very influential organization that supports a number of Republican events. They also have a number of Republican donors who flew across the country to participate in that event. And they also had a Republican aligned media personality, Ben Shapiro, who engaged in conversation with me on the issue of tariffs. And incidentally, he was opposed to them. And in a podcast subsequently to that, made his position very well known that he was opposed to tariffs against Canada.
But you guys, I got to sit at the cool kids table and I made so many new friends. That's basically her whole argument right there. I mean, she does have the little bit about Ben Shapiro, and he did shortly after that come out and say, hey, I think tariffs are bad. Of course, that whole argument would be undercut if weeks before he had actually come out and said that he thought tariffs were bad.
Seriously, I don't understand. What is the goal? That I want President Trump to succeed. If President Trump is to succeed, we need a thriving economy. Declaring a trade war on Canada under the terms of the USMCA, which he himself negotiated in Trump term 1, is not going to be a productive move for his administration. And there's more to come, by the way. I mean, President Trump is expected to issue a bunch of new tariffs come April 2nd. I mean, he openly said that in the State of the Union address. If there is a plan here, the markets would love to hear it. Because, again, the markets are simply looking for some sort of predictability here. The markets are simply looking for some sort of understanding of what's coming next and why it's coming next and what the plan is. But if the idea is that tariffs themselves would enrich the American people, that is against pretty much all economic knowledge for the last couple of centuries or so. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it'll turn out to be great. Or maybe the Dow Jones Industrial Average has been speaking over the course of the last couple of months and it disagrees. The reason this matters is because what President Trump is actually trying to do in so many areas is so important. We cannot have the agenda founder on the rocks of misbegotten tariff wars.
So Ben Shapiro disliked tariffs so much that he thought that it would cause Donald Trump's agenda to, and I want to make sure I get this right, founder on the rocks, and set his agenda apart. That was, by the way, 2 weeks before the event at PragerU. So, and you can go back even farther and find plenty of examples of Ben Shapiro saying that he does not like tariffs. There's a lot of people who don't like tariffs, especially people who are on the receiving end of them. But the argument that somehow this translated into Ben Shapiro changing his position from a position that he's held for a great deal of time it's bullshit. It's just bullshit. Danny wanted to go sit at the cool kids table. She was going to be able to sit and have a conversation with a big deal social media influencer at a big deal far-right conservative, well, hard-right conservative, very, very religious. She did an interview as well, so technically there were two maybe podcasts that came out of it. But she did an interview with the PragerU lady, and wow, that's a wild ride. Not saying, just saying. There's no answer for it. Again, it is an entitled premier who is doing all of the things that she couldn't do on her own. If she didn't have the taxpayers' money, if she didn't have the position, she wouldn't be able to do any of these things. But now she can, and boy, you better believe she will. There were other questions that came up too, and there was a very interesting one that Head Nenshi asked that Danielle Smith actually went out of her way to not answer. So the format, and the reason why we're kind of breaking these questions up a little bit, the format is bizarre. So you get a block time, and you get, I think it was 5 minutes that Head Nenshi got to ask his questions, and then Danielle Smith got to respond for 5 minutes, and then Head Nenshi got to ask questions for 5 minutes, but he had to like stack 7 or 8 questions inside of that 5 minutes for the most part. So it was a very bizarre thing. So Danielle Smith could pick and choose what she wanted to respond to and effectively filibuster or just talk for extended periods of time, reading off things that were totally immaterial to a lot of the questions that were asked to run out the clock. And this is one of the questions that she actively went out of her way to avoid.
We know that Invest Alberta CEO Rhys Christians resigned abruptly after 4 years in the role. His expenses were $615,000 over that time, and the final 6 months of 2025 are still unposted. So why did the CEO resign so suddenly? Was the Premier informed in advance? Will we see those receipts? And did Mr. Christiansi receive severance? If so, how much? And on what terms?
She didn't answer that one. She didn't even come close to answering that one. She talked about the Wyant report, and she read off like all of the recommendations from the Wyant report to kill time, but she went out of her way to not answer that one. And given all of the things that we've heard about Invest Alberta and the whole episode that we did where we talked about their very, very too expensive trips to Jasper, where they spent tens of thousands of dollars on very fancy food for their executive leadership retreats. There's plenty of reasons to ask lots of questions. But again, it's part of this greater theme of, well, if we're using taxpayers' money, we can do whatever we want. And that led into quite the revelation.
There is a specific question here on a specific flight. Last fall, when the government invoked the notwithstanding clause to end the teachers' strike, Mr. Chair, I noticed that my speaker time is not going down on the big screen there. There we go. Thank you. The Premier and senior staff traveled to Riyadh and Dubai, $64,000 in disclosed expenses. However, there's one flight missing, which is the Riyadh to Dubai flight. It's posted for a tour director, but none for the Premier or for her senior staff. It's 1,000 kilometers across desert highways. You don't drive that. I know this. So how did the Premier and senior staff travel from Riyadh to Dubai? Was it a private jet? Did someone else pay for it? Why is there no flight record for this leg? If it was paid for by a third party, under what terms and why was this not disclosed? If Alberta taxpayers paid, where are the receipts for this? And will the Premier table a full unredacted list of every official organization and individual she met during the trip, along with the purpose and the outcomes?
Now, it's important to put a little bit of timeline in here because Danny's been to the Middle East a bunch. She likes to go there on trips, it seems, and apparently enjoy the benefits of those trips, which we'll get to in just a sec. But this flight, the one that we're talking about here, this trip was just back in November, right when the teacher strike was on. You may remember there was a picture that surfaced because as the legislature was actively debating the invocation of the notwithstanding clause to rob teachers of their charter rights, Danny was in an airport lounge. She wasn't even in the legislature. She wasn't even there to do the thing. She was going on a trip. But her answer has, stirred up a whole lot of conversation.
When it comes to the flight that the member was asking about to Saudi Arabia, first of all, I can happily give a list of the individuals that we met with in the Middle East. I had an opportunity to meet His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman Al Saud. I met him at the World Petroleum Congress when I first announced our intention to grow our oil and gas production to 8 million barrels per day. And he and I had a bond over the fact that we believe that we should be reducing global poverty at the same time as we're reducing global emissions and making sure we have energy security. And so that friendship developed into a invitation for me to be hosted by him in the kingdom. And the protocol in Saudi Arabia and hosting us, they provided the accommodation. It was approved by the ethics commissioner in advance. When it came to the flight that we took, it was a private plane, non-commercial aircraft. It was proposed by the government of Saudi Arabia in order to enable efficient movement around the country, including to locations with limited commercial airline services. In fact, we went to the million barrel a day oil field is one of the stops that we went to that has now been shut down as a result of the conflict in the Middle East. And so having that perspective was really important for me to have. We also consulted and received prior approval from the ethics commissioner to use non-commercial aircraft during that mission. So it was fully disclosed to the ethics commissioner.
And this is where we get to address the great lie of Alberta's ethics laws, because the ethics commissioner, under normal circumstances, pre-Danny, the ethics commissioner could only hold people to account based on what was in the legislation. And it was some pretty weak sauce. Danny took that weak sauce and added about 1,000 liters of water and made the sauce even weaker. And this is something that led to our coverage of the whole skybox scandal, or what the NDP later termed the corrupt care scandal, because she went on a podcast and she talked about how she wanted to change the ethics rules so that she could accept bigger gifts, so that she could get better access to bigger events. She was very clear about that. It's a wild conflict of interest. And it's certainly what she said there, where she kind of soft pedaled it. She didn't get really into all the details, because with the individual with whom she shared her bond over global poverty, she allegedly stayed in 7-star hotel. I did not know that you could have 7-star. I thought like a 5-star hotel was as high as it got. I had no idea that there was such a thing as 7-star hotels. I am not wealthy. 7-star hotels, private jets hosted by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. My personal favorite part of that clip, though, was where she talks about how she went to the million barrel a day oil field. And given the conflict of that that's going on in the Middle East right now, that perspective was very important for her. For the life of me, I cannot imagine why seeing it in person would have any change on her role as Premier of Alberta. It's silly. But that's the explanation that she offered nonetheless. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about the ethics rules is that, as I said, Danielle Smith wrote them, and they are being interpreted by somebody who was a UCP candidate before being appointed to that role by the UCP of being the ethics commissioner. So I don't want to impugn whether or not there's any bias going on there. That's not my intention here, but there's certainly questions to be asked, because here's the problem. This would be a massive conflict of interest in almost any other professional organization, period, end of sentence, to be accepting gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from somebody who has a vested interest in being your competition. Or who has the potential to try to influence your decisions. It's a huge conflict of interest to use your position to access those sorts of things. It's a page straight out of the Trump handbook, but it is completely devoid of any kind of real ethics. So if the ethics commissioner did approve these things, that is, if anything, an indictment for how much Danielle Smith and the UCP have weakened the ethics protections in the province of Alberta. And Head Nenshi very much saw that reality too.
And I'm quite surprised to hear that the flight between Riyadh and Dubai was one where it was not commercially available to flights. It's one of the most traveled flight corridors in the world between Riyadh and Dubai, and there's a gazillion commercial flights. And I do highlight that when the Premier was a journalist, she took several strips off of the then Prime Minister for daring to take a private flight, not a private flight supplied by a foreign government. So I'd be very interested if the Premier could please table the Ethics Commissioner's advice on whether it's okay for the Premier to accept a private jet flight for her and her staff from a foreign government.
She did not. She did not table that. She has not made that publicly available. And she likely will not, because if the Ethics Commissioner is any good at their job, one would expect a decision, something to the effect of, I can find nothing in this that breaches the Conflict of Interest Act, but I would advise strongly against this because, while not breaching the Conflict of Interest Act, it does, in fact, raise some very real concerns. If the Ethics Commissioner was any good at his job, that's what they would say. And I don't think that, I mean, the two options from there is either they didn't say that, which is not great, or they did, and Danny doesn't want other people to know. So do with that what you will. But there was a stunning follow-up that occurred just 2 days later inside of the legislature, and this turned into a whole other thing.
Alberta taxpayers spent $65,000 so that the Premier could accept hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than a house, from a foreign government.
That's right.
This was not hockey tickets. It wasn't even luxury watches as gifts. It would be, if true, the largest kickback any politician in Canadian history has ever received, worth more than a house in Alberta. And of course, this doesn't include other undisclosed gifts from foreign governments, including a giant golden cat. Will the Premier disclose all gifts she has received from foreign governments?
Premier.
Well, yes, Mr. Speaker. Whenever we have any kind of protocol exchange, I always report that to the Ethics Commissioner, and then the Ethics Commissioner indicates whether or not we have to receive it on behalf of the Government of Alberta, whether we have to disclose this. We have very clear rules about that, Mr. Speaker. The disclosures, I've had my meeting this year with the Ethics Commissioner. This particular trip, we had a number of exchanges with him in advance so that he understood that we were doing the kind of trip that we often do in Alberta in hosting people to see our oil sands. And he signed off on the trip, Mr. Speaker. That's the reason why it was disclosed. It was disclosed in the appropriate way to the appropriate entity.
Honourable member.
But of course, this government has removed the need for public disclosure, or it seems disclosure to her own caucus.
And that's an important feature of the changes that Danielle Smith has made to the rules in regarding ethics. And you can go, it's the same principle. It's supposed to be the same principle as the reason why, if you invoke the notwithstanding clause, it's only good for 5 years. Because if you do a thing and it's a big deal, then the electorate, the voters, should be able to judge you on that. So if you did accept a golden cat, then that's something that the voters should be able to know about. If you did accept, again, 7-star hotels, I can't even wrap my mind around what that would be like. I would not want to stay in one. I'll be honest. I would feel bad. But if you have done those things, and this is where it gets wild, because there have been rumors of Danielle Smith a few years back. So not on this trip. And this is the whole thing that's important to highlight. Not on this trip in November, but a few years back, there have been rumors that she was gifted a golden cat. And there have been a lot of people who have been trying to find proof of this, if you will. And in the wake of this, there's been two very, very interesting things that have happened. The first one is there's a lot of folks who feel like they found it in a picture very recently with Danielle Smith and Jeremy Farkas in Calgary. Because if you look at the background, just above Mr. Farkas's shoulder there, and I'm not saying that Mr. Farkas is in any way involved with the golden cat thing. He's just a guy who happens to be sitting in front of it because bad luck. But that's the cat, allegedly. That is the golden cat that Danielle Smith received as a gift. And this has further been claimed to be corroborated by the Republican Party of Alberta leader, Cam Davies. He says that's the cat. He says that he's seen it in person. He described it. And so Danielle Smith received a golden cat from the Saudis, and nobody knew about it nobody could prove it up until then she asked that question in the legislature. And that's just how bonkers of a timeline we're living in. So there's that. But it gets back to the greater point of the entitlement, the belief that I deserve all of the nice things. That's why I'm premier. And anybody who gets in my way deserves my wrath. And that topic did come up because in the course of the questions, Naheed Nenshi brought up a bunch of different things about the corrupt care scandal. But there was one question in particular that we're going to spend a little bit of time on tonight because it has been the source of a great deal of fuckery.
So let's start with correcting the record on the former AHS CEO. The Premier has suggested that the former AHS CEO has mishandled an RCMP investigation in British Columbia. The CEO, of course, has denied this, but it, of course, is going to become a matter under legislation. So I'm just going to ask the Premier what evidence she relied upon when making that statement, if she'll table that evidence today, or if she's willing to apologize to the CEO and correct the record before we are the subject of even more litigation on this. And ultimately, the critical question here is how much public money has been spent defending the government's position in the former CEO's wrongful dismissal lawsuit? Will the government table a full cost breakdown, including external legal fees? It just so happens that in this case, the Premier and I share a lawyer, and he is the most expensive litigator in Canada. And so I would love to know how much taxpayer money has actually been spent on doing this work. Similarly, Justice Wyant was given an initial, and I should add, given that the government has canceled the contracts that were the primary source of the former CEO's complaint, so she was right, will the government discontinue this legal action given that they've admitted that she was right, and how much money is this going to cost us if they don't?
The core of that question had to do with the money. Because when you take a look at the amount of, let me tell you, folks, I can, from firsthand experience, law stuff is not cheap. not even a little bit. And as many of you are aware, the breakdown and me are I'm always so bad at the me's and the I's. Both the breakdown and I are being sued by MH Care and Sam Mraiche for $6 million. That lawsuit has been going on for just over almost a year and a half now. And it has not been a cheap venture by any stretch of the imagination. And I am eternally grateful for the support that we get from folks in making sure that we're able to continue defending ourselves. More on that coming soon, hopefully. But it's not a cheap process. And I'm not fighting the government with all of their bajillion lawyers. And they've got a good number of lawyers from and she said it himself, the most expensive litigator in the country is working on this case. So this is not a cheap process for the taxpayer to fight Athana's lawsuit. If anybody's just to do the quick recap, Athana was fired at the beginning of January. Athana Mentzelopolous was fired at the beginning of January. She has launched a wrongful dismissal lawsuit against the government of Alberta. And that process, that legal process that she's been going through has been responsible for leaking a lot of the documents that have confirmed that there was skullduggery afoot. At a lot of different levels. And as much as Danielle Smith likes to point to the Wyant report and say, and we're going to get to the Wyant report in a bit, as much as she likes to point to the Wyant report and say, hey, there was no politicians that were found to be involved, that's not true. And was also not part of the scope of the investigation, which is something that Judge Wyant articulated very clearly himself in the report. So, not really a win. But the question was about the money. How much have we spent on this, defending against this lawsuit? And there's something called the sunk cost fallacy, which is where at a certain point, you just start throwing good money after bad. You just keep throwing good money after bad because you've committed this far already. But it would be worth knowing if the costs of all of the legal things and the Judge Wyant report and everything else, if that has exceeded $1.7 million, what are we winning here as taxpayers? What are we winning here? And especially given the fact that so much of what Athana Mentzelopolous has claimed has turned out to be entirely true. It's been verified. What are we doing here as taxpayers? And that brings us to the other part of the question that had to do with asking for an apology. And this is I was going to play the first part of the clip again because I really want to make sure that this is clearly understood.
So let's start with correcting the record on the former AHS CEO. The Premier has suggested that the former AHS CEO has mishandled an RCMP investigation in British Columbia. The CEO, of course, has denied this, but it, of course, is going to become a matter under legislation. So I'm just going to ask the Premier what evidence she relied upon when making that statement, if she'll table that evidence today, or if she's willing to apologize to the CEO and correct the record before we are the subject of even more litigation on this.
So Danielle Smith has alleged that the former AHS CEO, Athana Mentzelopolous, mishandled an RCMP investigation. Mentzelopolous has denied this. How did Danny justify it?
Well, I would encourage the member to search the CBC and the BC Ombudsman report for the false allegations that were made that resulted in the suicide of an individual for whom those false allegations were made against. That was publicly reported at the time. And so that's what I rely on for my information, and I would encourage him to look at that as well.
I'm going to play that clip one more time, too, because this gets ridiculous really quickly.
Well, I would encourage the member to search the CBC and the BC Ombudsman report for the false allegations that were made that resulted in the suicide of an individual for whom those false allegations were made against. That was publicly reported at the time. And so that's what I rely on for my information, and I would encourage him to look at that as well.
So what Smith is implying there is that there were false allegations that were made, and Athana was part of those false allegations. That's the implication. If that's your response to why do you say that the former CEO mishandled an investigation, and your response is, well, there were false allegations that were made and it resulted in a suicide, then the direct implication of that statement is that the person in question is somehow directly responsible. And it's bullshit. There's a whole lot of what Danielle Smith says in that response that's bullshit. And we're going to try to unpack some of that bullshit tonight. Now, I want to be very, very, very clear about a few things here. First of all, yes, I have a bias here. And my bias it's twofold. I'm a big fan of the truth. I like the truth a lot. I find that the truth is very helpful in understanding circumstances. So that's my biggest bias. I don't like when people piss in my ear and tell me that it's raining. I just don't appreciate that. And especially when it's coming from as up high as the Premier of Alberta, I really, really, really don't appreciate that. I also really, really, really don't like bullies. I don't like people who abuse their power to punch down on people. I really don't like people who lie. And I really, really don't like people who weaponize misinformation, disinformation to try to score political points. I also, full disclosure, it's fairly well known, but I'll say it at the beginning of this, allegedly It hasn't been denied in any of the legal papers that have gone back and forth in the Mentzelopolous lawsuit. The Premier's office tried to have me fired twice. They asked Athana to fire me twice. She did not. I am grateful for that. That does not, however, have anything to do with what we're going to talk about next. Because what Danielle Smith is referring to in that piece there needs to be unpacked a little bit. Let's start with what happens when we search the CBC. She said search the CBC. Well, we did. And it turns out when you search the CBC for RCMP and Athana as your two search terms, the only things that come up are all of the stuff that's happened here in Alberta. You get a couple pages of it. But that's all you really get. If you search the CBC, you can go, well, that's Google though. That's Google. And Danny said to search the CBC. What if you try a bunch of different search terms with the CBC? We did. And same thing, nothing comes up. There are no results for a variety of search terms. Ironically enough, as soon as you take out the BC part, you do get, again, several pages of results, but those are all in regards to the scandal here in Alberta. So you got to ask, what is it that Danny's actually talking about? Because searching the CBC for Athana Mentzelopolous scandal, any of those things only gets you all of the Alberta results. And there's a good reason for that. Because Danny's taking something that happened over a decade ago and twisting it in some really ugly ways. In order to make sense of this, we're going to go to a story from the Walrus. And this details, the story itself is from after, quite a ways after the events. It was written in September 2019 with the benefit of hindsight. And it details how one very junior, very zealous, allegedly, employee who was not Athana Mentzelopolous, for the record, thought that she had uncovered evidence that there were researchers who were inappropriately accessing health data. There was a program that existed where researchers with the University of British Columbia, University of Victoria could access health data. Generally, I believe, I'm working from a little bit of memory here, there was multiple safeguards in place, and it was all random or anonymized. That's the word I was looking for. So it was just data about how well certain programs were working, which is in a totally appropriate way to do it. But this very junior person who'd maybe had a history of making some of these allegations, this very junior person believed that she had found evidence that there were multiple researchers who had inappropriately been accessing data. Now, I want to be very, very, very clear from the outset. She was wrong. She was horribly, horribly wrong. And the process that unfolded from there was unbelievably flawed and unbelievably tragic. Because what ended up happening was a bunch of researchers, the government apparatus. And again, I want to be very clear, the former AHS CEO Athana Mentzelopolous was not part of this process at all. The government apparatus in BC at the time took the conclusions apparently as fact and ran with them. And it culminated in a day in September where the researchers were fired, and a press conference was held. And this is where we get to the Ombudsman report that Danielle Smith was talking about. The Ombudsman report is called Misfire, the 2012 Ministry of Health Employment Terminations and Related Matters. Now, to be clear, this is a 510-page document. Athana Mentzelopolous' name appears a whopping 11 times. All of them have to do with the creation of a press release on the same day as the terminations. And This is an incredibly complex and nuanced situation, and it is one I'm going to try to navigate as delicately as I possibly can, because unfortunately, in the wake of that, several months later, one of those researchers did end up dying from suicide. That is unbelievably tragic. It is also not any one person's fault. I need to be very, very clear about that. Athana's involvement was solely around the drafting of the press release. And there was debate with the press group, the Government Communications and Public Engagement Group, of which Athana was the deputy minister. There was debate as to whether or not to include a reference to the fact that the RCMP were tangentially involved. And this is where the things did not, there were mistakes that were made. What were the mistakes? Well, let's take a look. So if we take a look at the conversation and why there was a decision to, or what Ms. Mentzelopolous decided to include the RCMP piece. If people hear there's a data breach and it hasn't been come officially from government, us saying we've screwed up, we've had a data breach. If it's instead somebody from the ministry saying to the press as an unnamed source, there's been a data breach, then you actually have a doubly worse story. Like you have to. When you make a mistake of this magnitude in government, the best thing you can do is own it quickly. Because Mr. Whitmarsh and others, including Ms. Mentzelopolous, saw the primary issue as being a data breach, talking about the human resources decision was one more way of the government demonstrating it was serious about protecting privacy. As Ms. Mentzelopolous told us, I said we can't have people thinking that we're trying to hide something. So if there was a data breach, we had to have let everybody know. So to be clear, at that point when the decision was being made to take a look at doing a press release, there had already been a leak. The communications director specifically remembered Mr. Whitmarsh telling her that the press release would not be changed. She said when Mr. Whitmarsh finished his call with Mr. Fife, he told him that it was all a misunderstanding. The communications manager also remembered Mr. Whitmarsh stepping out of the room to speak with the deputy attorney general. We asked him if the communications director of the deputy minister who made the decision to stick with the original wording in the news release, and he told it was the deputy minister. Ms. Mentzelopolous told us she would have supported the mention of the RCMP referral as long as it was true. In her view, the government needed to demonstrate that it was serious about dealing with privacy breaches, and describing the referral to the RCMP would show such leadership. However, in the interview with us, she said she had misjudged how news of a privacy breach would quickly be overrun by the news of the dismissals and the RCMP referral. Also important to take note, the morning of that breach, or of that press release, the morning of that press release where the government of BC announced the breach, it had already been leaked to a local media outlet. They already had the story. So the worst thing that it appears you can accuse this group of people of doing is trying to get ahead of the story and ensuring that they were demonstrating that they were taking that breach seriously. Now, there are some people who have spoken out in the wake of that who have said that they were deeply alarmed to hear that the RCMP were getting involved. And for some people, that would absolutely be a scary thing to know that the RCMP have been referred and there's an RCMP investigation. That would be a very scary thing. Now, the problem with the press release was there was miscommunications about the degree of the RCMP involvement. So while there had been conversations with the RCMP had said, we're not doing an investigation until you give us all of the information. We're just not going to do it. So there was some confusion. But even if we go down the road of hearing these words that there may be an RCMP investigation would be scary for some, there are some people who would argue that there were some people who might have taken solace in that, and that their biggest disappointment was that there wasn't, as they found out months later, an RCMP investigation. And one of those people is the sister of the individual who died from suicide.
And when he got the news, what was the impact on him?
It destroyed him, because he couldn't continue with his PhD subject. That was, not going to happen. He actually went to the university and withdrew from the program because he knew that he would not be able to focus on that. And I'm pretty sure that he had expected there to be an RCMP investigation that he would at least be able to get to tell his side or something to.
So he was looking for that to clear his name as well.
Oh, yeah, he would, maybe the RCMP could have figured out why they were fired.
I do not want to minimize the hardship and stress and trauma that being fired from your job, losing your academic future, would have on a person. And the government of BC later came out and basically said they shit the bed on the whole investigation. But clearly, Athana's role, minuscule though it was, did not have any effect on his decision. His own sister articulated that much in that clip a couple of years after the tragedy unfolded. Now, like I said, the government of BC did come out and they said they screwed up the investigation badly. There was some compensation that went out. There were also some other questions about things that happened. It was a very poorly managed situation. But for the Premier of Alberta to grossly misrepresent that tragedy, to score political points against what she clearly views, who she clearly views to be a political adversary, is a craven level of politics that I'm afraid I just can't wrap my head around, because everything that Danielle Smith said in that clip was a lie. We searched CBC. There's no articles that tie Athana in any way to those events. We read the Ombudsman report and the whole 11 mentions of Athana's name. Her role was purely tied to the crafting of the press release, which, if anything, it sounds like, from the gentleman's own sister, may have given him a little bit of hope that was unfortunately taken away when the RCMP did not go ahead with an investigation because the BC government realized they'd screwed it all up so badly. I am constantly shocked at the lows that this premier will sink to, especially given that it is directly demonstrable. We had somebody on this show who lost a family member directly attributable to Danielle Smith's policies. But she's going to try to claim the moral high road with a bullshit lie? It's gross. And the fact that she will double down on that in the hallways and the rooms of government, well, she'll just lie. And it's lazy lies. It took 10 minutes for us to verify. There's no CBC stories on this. What is she talking about? This is making stuff up because she thought she could throw a little elbow in at the CBC while she was throwing a little elbow in at somebody who has done more to uncover corruption in government and government organizations than any person that I can think of in recent history. It's just gross. So you have to ask the question, if Danielle Smith didn't hear about this from the CBC, if she didn't hear about this from the sources that she claims, who else has been talking about this in recent history? And that's where we get to these fucking guys. Because for anybody who's not familiar, David Wallace and James DeFiore spent the better part of last year doing everything they could to bully and denigrate a certain group of people, of which I was one. But they really went after Athana particularly hard. They went after Kerry particularly hard. And it was gross. And there's some questions that need to be asked about how much Danny knew and when she knew it. And they're very, very valid questions. Because one of the other things that former UCP minister and Progressive Tory Party, I can't say it with a straight face, I'm so sorry, MLA Peter Guthrie raised had to do with this exchange right here.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Minister of Health said that his minister was, quote, freaked out about the allegations. If the minister was so freaked out, he should have called the RCMP, called the Auditor General, called anyone. And the same deputy said on the record, quote, I definitely know that Marshall was involved on that side, end quote. That's the Premier's former Chief of Staff directly implicated in the procurement of recovery centres. Why has this government refused to tell Albertans which recovery centre contracts benefited their buddy from the corrupt care scandal?
The Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member from Airdrie Cochrane had way too many tomahawk steaks and specialty drinks to understand that he was making an error in judgment when the minister told him that it was a case of mistaken identity. There were two companies. One of them is the one that the Indigenous communities contracted with that has no relationship to anything that is being discussed, notwithstanding the accusations being made with the benefit of privilege in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, and they will not repeat it outside because they know it is not true.
Allegedly, it was true, by the way, before we get to the other piece. Allegedly, it was true. That was one of the stories that broke this week. The Globe and Mail broke the story about how the Maluka Construction and Maluka Consulting were allegedly working together to strong-arm construction companies into getting deals with Indigenous folks. So it was they were allegedly directly related. They were allegedly. Yep. But the interesting part of that clip is the reference to the tomahawk steaks and the specialty drinks, because that was something that these two guys talked about on the regular. So David Wallace and James DeFiore were running their mouths about tomahawk steaks and specialty drinks. They were advancing this whole bullshit narrative. It's just demonstrably false about Athana Mentzelopolous. And all of a sudden, the Premier's repeating all of the same things. I would be very curious to hear from the Premier under oath, because we know that she's such a good liar. I would be very curious to hear if she was one of those very small number of people that were actually paying attention to what these two idiots were up to, alleged idiots. I feel like they're idiots because they've been getting a lot of media attention themselves. And they claim, the court records show, because, and this is where it gets so bonkers, the story goes that these guys were running their mouths so hard against an investment banker named Sandy Edmonstone, who was a board member of AHS at the time that Athana was fired and was very likely going to be a witness. They started trying to, he argues, intimidate him, harass him, denigrate him, defame him. And so he went to a judge and got a very rare legal order called an Anton Pillar order, which allowed lawyers and sheriffs, bailiffs, to seize all of their electronics. And when these people went to Wallace's and DeFiore's residence, they immediately called a lawyer who works for Sam Mraiche. And I know he works for Sam Mraiche because in the run-up to me getting sued for $6 million, he sent me a letter saying that he was going to report me to the Human Rights Commission for asking for comment on the Skybox episode because I was being racist. I was not being racist. So that's a fun whole little side quest. But the connections that find their ways back between the UCP government, Marshall Smith, Danielle Smith, it's all quite fascinating, particularly when you take a look at the whole procurement piece, because there's another little bit here that's worth highlighting, because Naheed Nenshi did follow up on this question.
The government fired the AHS CEO and board for daring to ask questions about Sam Mraiche. That was not AHS, that was the government. And the Premier has undertaken a systemic campaign of character assassination against that CEO. Given that she was right about everything, will the Premier apologize?
Point of order was noted at or about 10:21. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask the member opposite to once again read the Judge Wyant report because it is very clear that there were irregularities within Alberta Health Services in how they were managing procurement contracts, how they were dealing with conflicts of interest, how they were dealing with oversight, how they were dealing with having a second set of eyes and legal review. It's part of the reason, Mr. Speaker, why we have moved that procurement function into an oversight by the Deputy Minister of Executive Council so that we can have standardized contracts and make sure that this never happens again in any department.
Honourable member.
I've read the Wyant report. The Premier clearly didn't get to the first line of the Wyant report, which says he was limited in investigating this government and could call no conclusions.
Now, I'm going to put the cherry on top of this whole thing in two different ways. The first one is Danielle Smith has made the argument that the whole reason why they were moving procurement out of AHS was because of the problems that they found, which is fascinating because if we take a look at the statement of claim from Athana Mentzelopolous, it was the plan all along. In early 2024, Marshall Smith told Mentzelopolous that an individual named Jitendra Prasad was his guy, quotes, and that Prasad had been put in place in Alberta Health to make sure that the government could get contracting right. Shortly after this discussion, Prasad contacted Mentzelopolous and advised he was close to Marshall Smith, and he was working to set up a new healthcare contracting group within Alberta Health. That's government, not Alberta Health Services. For her part, Mentzelopolous was uncomfortable with the inference that Prasad would be taking some level of direction from Marshall Smith and potentially the Premier's office on AHS procurement and contract issues that were specific to AHS, and that fell within Mentzelopoulos' mandate as president and CEO. So as much as Danielle Smith is trying to take a victory lap on, oh, look, we made all of these changes because all of these problems, she's just using it as an excuse to do the thing that she was going to do the whole time. Because this was always part of the plan. It just doesn't include Jitendra Prasad anymore. Unknown if Marshall Smith is still going to be involved. But this is where it gets bonkers. Like, if we're not bonkers enough yet. These two guys. Full disclosure. Like, I don't know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, whenever it was that Athana Mentzelopolous was appointed to AHS to be the CEO, we did this whole story before where we talked about all of the same things that we talked about tonight. But these two morons, this one particularly, that moron, I think he's a moron. I'm not saying for sure he's a moron. I feel like he's a moron because he was dumb enough to try to bribe me with $10,000 to do an episode targeting Athana Mentzelopolous. Now, anybody who knows me knows that the notion that I would take a bribe is wildly entertaining. So that's fun. The notion that you could pay me to do the wrong thing is wildly entertaining because I'm the guy that gets kicks out of calling out the bullies. But it's true. They legitimately offered $10,000 if I would do a hit piece on Athana Mentzelopolous. That's how desperate they, and presumably whoever their employer was, to try to destroy the people. And it should be embarrassing to the entire province that Danielle Smith continues to do the heavy lifting for whoever these hacks were working for. Alleged hacks, alleged morons, alleged idiots. All of those things are alleged. Those are my interpretations of their behavior. I cannot prove definitively that neither David Wallace nor James DeFiore are morons, idiots, or hacks. I cannot prove that. I can, however, prove that James DeFiore is a threat to public safety. Moving on from there, we got to talk about. I can get those guys off the screen. Enough of that. We got to talk about the supplemental report. So this gets bonkers. This also gets bonkers. It's a very bonkers show tonight. Maybe that's what we'll title it. The Bonkers Show. There's been the Wyant report. And in the Wyant report, there was an expectation that things would be revealed. And to some degree, they were. There were many things that were in the Wyant report that were demonstrably shown to illustrate that there was significant conflict of interest at the people who were involved in the procurement at AHS, that there was failure to follow best practices. The judge did a very good job of confirming all of those things. Thank you, Judge Wyant. But there was a couple of pieces that were left unresolved. One of them was a report, forensic financial audit kind of thing, by a group called RSM. And this was not allegedly done by the time that Judge Wyant provided his initial report. So he said in his report that it would come at a later date. And because it was Friday, Friday in comms circles is known as Take Out the Trash Day, because everybody's looking forward to their weekend and nobody's paying attention to what's going on, unless they are sad podcast hosts, I guess. But the RSM report was released, kind of. And we got to talk about the kind of a little bit, because there's some weird things about this report. First of all, the report comes to some conclusions that are pretty damning, and make the argument that the financial decisions that were made to purchase the Tylenot were unjustifiable. So there's that first piece. The first thing you see when you open up the file that the government has provided is this letter. And this letter is fascinating for a whole long list of reasons. The first chunk of it is, hey, so I said I was going to do this. The report was received. I will forward it as an addendum. Here it is. To summarize, and I'm quoting from the letter from Raymond Wyant. To summarize, based on the documentation reviewed, RSM was unable to find support for the contract value of $56 million between AHS and MH Care. Further, the RSM report details information with respect to the children's pain medication received under the purchase order. To that information, I can add the following updates as of February 12th, 2026, related to the children's medication stock and distribution. Medication received by HS, 1,473,619 bottles. Medication delivered to hospitals, 10,950. Medication delivered to retail and wholesale pharmacies, 4,700. Medication donated via Health Partners International Canada, 651,100 bottles. Medication disposed by AHS and delivered to Swan Hills Treatment Center, 806,869 bottles. So we destroyed most of it. And that's fun. But it's the next paragraph that got our attention, because in it, he says, finally, I attach as an appendix to this letter a brief explanation with respect to part of my report dealing with the RFP, or request for purchase processes, for the Central and Southern Zone chartered surgical centers. And it's not there. The appendix that he talks about in his letter to the premier, who he wasn't supposed to be dealing with directly anyways, the appendix is not there. It's just not there. This is an incomplete report. The appendix is not there. You can go look. It's not there. We saved the file. It is definitely not there. There is no appendix. So somebody took the appendix that had to do with the chartered surgical facilities and said, what if we just don't release that? It is absolutely wild. But that's not all, because if we take a look at a couple of different things, there were questions about the supplemental report, and when it would be showing up, and we really, really, really need to play a clip right now.
It's interesting that the Premier talks about the Wyant report, which I'm not sure she's read, because here is what Justice Wyant did say in his own report. He said he couldn't get to the bottom of the Turkish Tylenot scandal, that he couldn't figure out how much money Mr. Mraiche was still holding from this government, maybe $50 million, maybe more. And he said that he would write a supplemental report on this specific issue. It's been 6 months. We haven't seen the supplemental report. Has the government seen the supplemental report? What does it say? And when will they table it here?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a DM that oversees that process, and they have not given us an indication that that report has been received yet, but we look forward to reading it when it is received. The Wyant report also said that there was no politician, no political staff, and no member of government who had made any error in the way that was handled. This was an AHS internal procurement problem, and now we're going to be ensuring that we've changed the processes so nothing like this happens again. We'll see if the Auditor General has anything more to add in improving those processes, and we look forward to that report as well.
Oh, she's very excited to hear the Auditor General's report. More on that in a second. But that clip was from March 17th, where Danielle Smith said there's a deputy minister, and she has not indicated to me that we have received the report. But if we go to the opening letter page on the report that was sent to the deputy minister, it was sent on January 31st, 2026. So, what? The report was sent on January 31st, 2026. And what gets even more wild is down at the bottom, it says the following draft report sets out the findings with respect to this matter. It's literally right there at the bottom. So the report that was included is a draft report, and it has the date that it was sent to the deputy minister who was overseeing the process of being January 31st. So like February and then March 7th. So like a month and a half. And somehow Danny didn't hear in a month and a half that the report had been received. I have so many questions. But it gets even more interesting because there's some things that occurred in the report that are really worth talking about. Because one of the big things that Danielle Smith and Adriana LaGrange have emphasized is that, well, there was the investigations, there's the Auditor General's report, there's the RCMP investigations, but there was no substantive investigations that were done before we fired the Athana. There was none of that. And if we take a look at what the pages actually say, they list multiple third-party preliminary findings. So document 2024-10-11, third-party preliminary findings report. This preliminary third-party report reviews whether AHS followed applicable procurement policies and trade agreements when awarding the ASG contract, concluding that although the process met minimum technical requirements, negotiations and approvals occurred informally and earlier than documented. Document 2024-10-31, third-party correspondence with AHS. The third party summarizes interim findings regarding potential conflicts of interest involving former AHS employees in the ASG contract, identifying issues with undisclosed interests and overlapping roles, and identifying continued investigation while noting no basis to halt the contract extension. Third-party report on AHG contracts draft. This draft report analyzes conflict of interest and conduct involving former AHS personnel in the Ortho RFP and ASG contract, documenting overlap between employer roles and vendor interests and assessing risks arising from those relationships. Document review. Procurement review CEO Some Finery with attachments. AHS provides a consolidated summary of concerns related to ASG contracting, MH care procurement, and Central South Zone RFP processes, outlining potential conflicts of interest, vendor selection issues, and directives issued by Alberta Health. It goes on and on and on. And it's worth noting that the appendix that's supposed to have the chartered surgical stuff is missing from the report. So that's all kinds of fun. It's like they can't even get out of their own way. It's bonkers. But Danny said there that she was very, very excited to have the Auditor General's report. And we got to talk about that as our final segment for the night. And then we're going to call it a night. Because it came out. Well, first, let's go back. Let's go back in time a little bit. Let's go back all the way to November 3rd, when the Auditor General went to the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices and said, hey guys, I could really use like another year or two to really make sure that I'm able to finish this job on the things that I need to be Auditor Generaling. There's the AHS transition piece, I really need some more time to look at that properly. And there's the whole MH care procurement problem. I really need a little bit more time to look at that properly. And the committee, which is a majority UCP committee, said, "We will not be extending your contract, sir. Good day." And in that conversation, David Shepherd had some thoughts that are definitely worth revisiting.
Mr. Wiley is also currently in the process of conducting an investigation into what we on our side have termed the corrupt care scandal, that being seemingly credible allegations that we had large dollar contracts given without due and proper scrutiny to supporters and friends of members of this government and their political staff. Both of those investigations are still ongoing, and Mr. Wiley is overseeing them. Mr. Wiley is also in the process of doing the initial audits for the dissolution of Alberta Health Services under this government's orders and the creation of a large number of new health entities. Again, at the direction and order of this government. All of this, Mr. Chair, is incredibly significant work. It makes no sense to remove a capable and experienced public servant, officer of this legislature, from his role in the midst of such significant work that has such significant potential impact for the people of Alberta. Incredibly essential scrutiny, daylight into dark corners, Mr. Chair, of this government's actions. It is hard. It is difficult. It is nigh on impossible, Mr. Chair, to read this motion from Mr. Cyr on behalf of his government colleagues as anything but an attempt to interfere with the work of Mr. Wiley, to divert and detour from these essential investigations, to make it more difficult for the people of Alberta to get the answers they rightfully deserve. It is shameful, Mr. Chair, that this government is effectively choosing to fire an Auditor General doing such important work on behalf of the people, who has shown his due diligence, his incredibly high principle, to choose to effectively fire him in the midst of this significant work, these significant investigations, to strike a committee where these government members will hold the majority. Let's be clear, and they will have the ability to appoint the individual of their liking to take on this crucial and essential role. And let's be clear, Mr. Chair, this is a government that is well beyond having any trust from Albertans that they would not engage in some level of political interference in that process.
Now, there were some folks, and as you'll hear, there are still some folks, bafflingly, who make the argument that, well, you know, his contract is up. What are we going to do? The contract's up. What are you going to do? Mr. Shepherd had a response for that, too.
I just wanted to respond briefly to Mr. Cyr, who talked about requirements of the committee. Let's be absolutely clear. There is abundant past precedent for this committee to offer 1 or 2 year extensions to officers of the legislature, specifically when they are in a position like Mr. Wiley is in, where they have significant work they are undertaking, which requires just a little bit longer to complete. So any suggestion that this is anomalous or unusual, or that we are bound as a committee by anything, is quite contrary to the facts. The reality is, if these members wished, they could give Mr. Wiley the additional 2 years he has requested to continue the excellent work he has done and to complete these significant tasks he is doing on behalf of Albertans.
So they could have done it if they wanted to, but they did not want to. And this week, a column by Don Braid announced that the report would not be finished before Mr. Wiley's term has expired. He says in a statement that he released to Don Braid that he has come to the end of the interviews. He's come to the end of the investigation, but he won't have time to write the entire report. And that gets to be really, really relevant for a bunch of different reasons. But I want to go to yesterday's Your Province, Your Premier, where this question came up.
Why the Auditor General was denied an extension of his contract to allow him to complete his full review of this file. So can you explain all this for our listeners?
Well, I can tell you that it became pretty clear that there were problems with AHS procurement. And so we asked Judge Raymond Wyand to take a close look at it, which he did. He gave us a preliminary report and found a number of poor practices in procurement involving no tracking of conflict of interest, not having a second set of eyes on contracts, not having any real contract language about what happens for non-delivery. There were some real problems with that. So we've taken the 18 recommendations from that report and begun to implement them so that we have oversight over every aspect of procurement. On this matter in particular, obviously the facts speak for themselves. We made the public the documents available, and we're cooperating with both the RCMP as well as with the Auditor General to give them whatever documents it is they need. And if there is wrongdoing, then we would expect that they would deal with it that way. But since it's kind of at that level, we've completed the work with Judge Wyand. We're waiting for the Auditor General's report. He has said he'll have finished all of his inquiries and have recommendations before his contract comes to an end. Remember, we have a set term for the AG. It's 8 years.
But could you not extend that?
Going back to 1980, it's never been done. And so I think everybody knew that this contract was coming to an end. We have to have a process in place so that there's some certainty about what the next individual taking over will be able to do. And I understand that decision has been made and will be announced very soon, so that that they can have that transition period to be able to pick up seamlessly.
First of all, can we just all take a second to appreciate the phrase, going back to 1980, it's never been done. Going back to last week, Jason Kenney has never been premier. Like, it's such a dumb turn of phrase. The reality is, as you heard David Shepard articulate, these are exceptional circumstances. And one would hope that the Auditor General or any other public official would not be confronted with exceptional circumstances quite as extreme as these on the regular. One would hope that the degree of alleged corruption is not the norm, that it's the aberration. One would hope that. But going back to 1980, it's never happened. It's got to be one of the dumbest things I've heard in recent history. But she also tipped it there. One of the things that Danielle Smith tried to say to calm people down when it was announced that Doug Wiley was not getting his contract extended was that he could still apply for the job. Obviously, he's not getting the job because they've got a new person and there's going to be a transition period. But this is where things get a little bit interesting, because if that new person needs some time to review all of the materials, because they're the ones that are going to have to sign it, how long could that possibly take? Could take a good amount of time. It could. And if it takes a long enough amount of time that we run into an election period, then there's rules about what can be released before and during a campaign. So there's still lots of ways to make sure that this report doesn't see the public eye before the next election. And that should be cause for concern for everybody if that is truly how it comes out to play, because at that point, it should be viewed as a confession. That's just my opinion. I could be wrong. But she again reiterated on the same Your Province, Your Premier, that there would be no public inquiry. We do not need no public inquiry on the allegations of corruptions going all the way up to the highest levels of government. We don't need a public inquiry.
When Albertans hear police search warrants, many would conclude that this has moved beyond politics into potential criminality. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the private companies that are involved in this are going to have their own lawyers and their own case, and they're going to have to put it forward. And so I think the RCMP just needs to do their work.
Okay. Now, you've previously said you welcome these kind of investigations. At what point do you consider calling a full inquiry?
Well, I think that we have to understand that the Auditor General does have the power of compelling testimony, and so there were a few AHS executives who refused the request of Judge Wyant, and so that was some missing pieces. But I would fully expect that with his power to compel testimony, that everybody he has wanted to interview will have been interviewed. And if there are additional recommendations that he would make, then I guess we'll take that we'll take that seriously at the time that the report is released, which sounds like it's still going to take another few months.
Oh, good. She'll take it seriously. I feel so much better. It's not as if, again, just running down the short list, multiple members of Sam Mraiche's family were hired into government jobs by Danielle Smith's chief of staff, Marshall Smith. It's not as if Marshall Smith wasn't living in a mansion owned by Sam Mraiche's sister for a good part of the time where he was chief of staff. It's not as if Danielle Smith appointed Sam Mraiche's accountant to the board of Invest Alberta. It's not as if multiple ministers and her right-hand guy, the former chief of police for Edmonton, appear in multiple pictures in Sam Mraiche's skybox. Oh, wait, it's exactly all of those things. The fact that Danielle Smith is so reluctant, so hell-bent to not call a public inquiry at this point should really, like, we're saying the quiet part out loud now, especially with this week's developments, where the Globe and Mail revealed that the RCMP searched the offices of Sam Mraiche, the MH Care offices. They also searched Sam Jaber's accounting firm, the guy that Danielle Smith appointed to Invest Alberta. So at this point, the guy who Danielle Smith appointed to Invest Alberta is having his corporate offices searched, and there's been no public statement that he's going to take a step back from Invest Alberta for a little while, just while these things get sorted out. No, we're just going to let that skate. And then allegedly, there were also some homes that were searched as well. All of these people in multiple pictures. Danny took Mr. Jaber on a trip to the Middle East 2 weeks after he was appointed to the role of Invest Alberta. She doesn't get to extricate herself from this. And barring some highly unlikely developments, I can promise that over here at the Breakdown, we're going to do our very best to make sure that she doesn't get to just walk away from this, because she's got to own this. And there's perhaps nobody who can speak to the problems of entitlement and the belief that you're better than Albertans, than the person in the next clip that we're going to play, because this person makes a very powerful, articulate argument that a premier should be responsible. They should take ownership of the things that happen under their watch.
This government continues to claim they are living within their means, but when the Premier herself spends more on a single trip than thousands of hardworking Albertans earn in a single year, it is impossible to take those claims seriously. The Premier's credibility is in tatters, and with it, the credibility of the government on fiscal issues. Again, to the Premier, doesn't she see that her actions and her words simply don't line up?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, that is the reason and that when this issue first came up, I did go out and speak to Albertans. I was very forthright with Albertans, Mr. Speaker. There is no doubt that this is a number that troubles me as well. It was certainly part of the work that I did as the Premier of this province. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to do the work that Albertans have asked us to do. We had a throne speech yesterday and a budget on Thursday that will demonstrate clearly to Albertans, Mr. Speaker, that the fiscal framework that is in place in this province is going to allow for continued success. That is the work this government will continue to do, Mr. Speaker.
You know, it's wild. It's absolutely wild how much what Alison Redford said there sounds like what Danielle Smith has been saying in the legislature when she's been challenged on these extravagant trips and these the $20,000 to go speak with her social media hero and all of the trips to the Middle East so that she can access apparently golden cats and, again, 7-star hotels as gifts. She wouldn't have gotten the 7-star hotels and the private jet flights if she hadn't gone down there on the taxpayer's dime. She wouldn't have gotten those. So it's Danielle Smith takes the stance of, well, you know, we're doing government business. We're standing up for government just like we would for the oil sands here. We're doing the good work of Albertans' peoples. And that's exactly what Alison Redford said in her response. But the one striking difference between Alison Redford and Danielle Smith is at least Alison Redford took responsibility. She acknowledged what had happened and she apologized. Danielle Smith has done neither of those things. At no point has she apologized to Albertans, and at no point has she taken responsibility. If anything, she has mastered the art of blaming everybody else in the room. And what is particularly telling, if not damning, is that with the exception of Peter Guthrie, leader of the Progressive Tory Party, I'm so sorry. I will get there. I will get there. I will be able to say Progressive Tory Party. It's just such a terrible name. With a straight face. I will work on that for the next year. I will be ready for the next election. With the exception of Peter Guthrie, who some people have argued may have made a run for the doors when he realized how bad things were going to get. Not a single UCP MLA or minister has had the stones to step up and say, this is bad. This is wrong. This is a failure of what we came here to do. This is a complete betrayal of the trust that Albertans have placed in us. None of them seem to have a clue of what they've done wrong. And if they do, they don't seem to care enough about Albertans and the trust of Albertans to do anything about it. I cannot wrap my head around the lack of character and conviction that is on display in the UCP caucus right now. It is bonkers to me. The offices, that graphic's gone. The offices of people that they went to elite skybox hockey games with are being searched by the RCMP as part of an ongoing criminal investigation. And none of them are saying anything. None of them are saying Albertans deserve better than this. None of them are saying, you know what? Even if I get cooked, we need a public inquiry. We do. None of them will stand up and say that. Board member for Invest Alberta, his business searched by RCMP, company that has received, by some estimations, at least $1 billion, that's with a B, dollars in contracts from AHS alone. That's not including all the chartered surgical facility stuff. Upwards of $1 billion. Corporate offices being searched. And the response that we see from the government is fabricating stories about the former AHS CEO who did have the stones to step up and say something's wrong here. That dynamic is so backwards. If Danielle Smith and the UCP want to be leaders, they should fucking lead by example. To sit in silence is complicity, period, end of sentence. And that, again, speaks to the entitlement, because they're not going to reckon what's theirs in order to do the right thing. And that tells you everything that you need to know about any of their character. Because if any of them had even a fraction of the courage and strength that people like Athana Mentzelopolous have shown, that people like Carrie Tate have shown, that people like Mr. Edmonston have shown, and standing up and saying, this is wrong. The fact that there's not one single person on the UCP bench who could do the same thing is a pretty damning indictment of the culture over there. And that's our show. I'm going to do the plugs real quick. Fun to be back doing a live show. I missed it. We're going to be doing more of these more frequently, and maybe a few less of the interview episodes. That's the plan. We'll see what happens. It's always a shit show. But getting the plugs out of the way. If you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love nothing more that if you signed up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where you can sign up and help do a monthly commitment thing to help us do all of this. And we got some big plans for the summer. We're going to be doing live events in both Calgary and Edmonton. Hopefully we're going to get to a couple of the rural areas, because that's where a good part of my heart lives. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun, but we can only do those things because of the support that we get from our Patreon sponsors and the people who support us in other ways. If you're not into the regular long-term commitment thing, then you can also absolutely send us an e-transfer to info@thebreakdownab.ca. Same thing applies. We've got some fun stuff planned for the summer, but we want to be able to execute on properly. And in order to do that, we need to save up some monies. So you can help us do that if you like. And the other thing that I will plug right there is if you like the swag, we do still have, and we'll continue to have, our partnership with the good folks at Oddities. They handle all of our merch stuffs. You can get the hoodies, the t-shirts, the long sleeve shirts, the hats, all of the things. Check all that out at www.thebreakdownabmerch.ca. And I think that's it. I think that's all I have to plug, which is kind of wild. Anyways, here it is.
How's your BS detector evolved over time?
I tend to be pretty trusting.
It's this, I know I say this every time, but it is that second nod. It's just that, like, I got the right answer. I seemed like I was a human being. It just kills me every single time. Every single time. I will never get tired of that. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who is in the chat. I'm looking forward to reading all of the things in there. And with all of that being said, we'll see you here next week. God only knows what's going to happen in the next week, because last week was bonkers. We didn't even get to everything. But we'll see you next week. So in the meantime and in between time, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.